Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the UES Horizon, watching the stars through the main screen when the message came through the quantum array and changed everything for humanity forever. The signal was unlike anything they had received before, and it cut through all their communication channels at once with perfect clarity and spoke in flawless English, which made every crew member freeze in their positions. "Greetings to the species known as humanity," the voice said with a tone that carried both authority and subtle threat. "I am Ambassador Zethkai of the Velter Confederacy, speaking on behalf of the Galactic Council, and we have been watching your kind for many decades now." Morrison felt his heart pound as he realized this was first contact with an advanced alien civilization. But the words that followed made his blood run cold. "Your species has expanded beyond your home system and entered territories that concern the established civilizations of this galaxy, and the Council has decided that humanity must answer for their actions and justify their continued existence among the stars." The message continued with specific instructions for humanity to send representatives to appear before the Galactic Council within 6 months at a location called Nexus Station, and the ambassador made it clear that failure to comply would result in immediate containment, or worse, when the transmission ended. Morrison immediately contacted Earth Command, and within hours he found himself in a secure meeting with Admiral Kate Sullivan and the top brass of humanity's space forces. "Jake, this is bigger than anything we've ever faced," Admiral Sullivan said as she paced around the briefing room. "We're talking about the survival of our entire species, and they chose you to represent us." Morrison had commanded deep space missions for 15 years and had first contact protocols drilled into his head, but nothing had prepared him for the situation where humanity itself was on trial. "Why me?" Morrison asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Because you've handled more alien encounters than anyone else in the fleet, and because you think on your feet when everything goes wrong," Sullivan replied. "Plus, you don't back down from a fight even when the odds are against you." The Admiral assigned Morrison the best crew available for this crucial mission, and that included Dr. Alex Bennett, who was humanity's leading expert on alien languages and cultures, plus Commander Lisa Park, who had tactical skills that could prove vital if things went bad. Chief Engineer Danny Walsh joined the team because he could fix anything that broke, and they would need their ship running perfectly for whatever came next. They gave Morrison humanity's most advanced vessel, the UES Defiance, which had been built with the latest technology and weapons systems, though Morrison suspected that even their best ship would seem primitive compared to what the aliens had. 6 months of preparation passed quickly as teams of scientists and diplomats worked around the clock to prepare humanity's case and gather evidence that might save their species from whatever judgment awaited. The Morrisons studied everything they knew about the message and tried to understand what kind of beings they would face, but the information was limited and mostly speculation. The journey to Nexus Station would take them through several star systems that belonged to different alien species, and Morrison knew they would be watched and evaluated every step of the way. As the UES Defiance left Earth's solar system, Morrison looked back at the blue marble that held everyone and everything humanity had ever known and wondered if he would ever see it again. The first alien territory they entered belonged to a species called the Kethmori, who sent escort ships to guide them through their space, and Morrison got his first look at truly alien technology. The Kethmori ships moved without any visible propulsion and seemed to bend space around them in ways that made Morrison's engineers shake their heads in amazement. Bennett tried to establish communication with the escorts, but they remained silent except for navigation instructions, and Morrison could feel them studying his ship. And Kree system they passed through showed signs of ancient civilizations with massive structures that dwarfed anything humans had built, and Morrison began to understand just how young and small humanity was in the grand scheme of the galaxy. The crew remained professional, but Morrison could see the worry in their eyes as they realized they were heading toward a confrontation with beings who had mastered technologies that humanity could barely comprehend. Commander Park ran constant tactical assessments, but admitted privately that their weapons would be useless against civilizations that could build stations around neutron stars. As they approached the final jump point to Nexus Station, Morrison gathered his crew and tried to prepare them For whatever they would find, remember that we're not just representing ourselves. Morrison told them every human who ever lived and everyone who might be born depends on what we do in the next few days. The jump to Nexus Station revealed a sight that took Morrison's breath away and made him realize that humanity's trial would be unlike anything they had ever imagined. Nexus Station hung in space like a metal moon orbiting a neutron star that pulsed with deadly radiation, and the massive structure seemed to drink energy directly from the spinning stellar remnant. Morrison stared at the station through the main screen and tried to process what he was seeing, because the thing was easily 1,000 times larger than the biggest space station humanity had ever built. The surface bristled with towers and docking bays and defensive systems that could probably destroy entire fleets, and Morrison realized that this single structure represented more advanced engineering than his entire species had achieved. "Captain, the station is hailing us," Commander Park reported, and her voice carried the same awe that Morrison felt. Communication came through in perfect English again and directed them to a specific docking bay where they would be met by official escorts. And Morrison could hear the authority in the alien voices they used. Defiance approached the docking bay. Morrison saw ships from dozens of different species, and each one looked more advanced than anything in humanity's fleet. Docking process was handled by automated systems that guided their ship with precision that made their own technology seem crude by comparison, and Morrison felt like a cave dweller arriving at a modern city. When the airlock sealed, Morrison took a deep breath and stepped onto Nexus Station, with Dr. Bennett and Commander Park following close behind, while Chief Walsh stayed with the ship. The corridor beyond the airlock was vast and filled with beings from across the galaxy, and Morrison saw creatures he could never have imagined in his wildest dreams. Some walked on multiple legs while others floated without touching the ground, and a few seemed to be made of energy rather than solid matter. But all of them stopped to stare at the humans. An escort waited for them and introduced itself as Guide Velanoth of the Station Authority, and it looked like a tall insect covered in metallic scales that shifted color as it moved. "Welcome to Nexus Station, representatives of humanity," Guide Velanoth said through a translation device. "You will be taken to quarters appropriate for your species, and tomorrow you will appear before the Galactic Council." The quarters were comfortable, but clearly designed for beings much larger than humans, and Morrison felt small and insignificant as he prepared for what might be humanity's final judgment. Next morning, Guide Velanoth led them through corridors that seemed to stretch forever, and Morrison saw more alien species than he knew existed in the Galactic Council chambers were beyond anything Morrison had imagined, and the vast amphitheater could have held a small city with seating for thousands of representatives from 47 different species. At the center of it all sat the High Arbiter on a throne that seemed to be carved from a single crystal and Kalthara of the ancient Zephyrians. Looked like a being of pure light wrapped in flowing robes. Morrison had studied what little information they had about the Zephyrians and knew they had achieved faster than light travel when humans were still discovering fire and had been exploring the galaxy for thousands of years. Other species filled the massive chamber, and Morrison could feel their eyes on him as he walked to the small platform reserved for the accused. At the center of the amphitheater, Arbiter Kalthara spoke in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once, and announced that the trial of humanity would now begin. The species known as humanity stands accused of aggressive expansion beyond their home system, despite their primitive nature and tendency toward violence, the Arbiter said. They have entered space without permission from established civilizations and represent a potential threat to galactic peace. Morrison felt the weight of judgment from thousands of alien beings and realized that most of them had already decided humanity was guilty. First witness was called, and Ambassador Zethkai of the Velter took the stand to present evidence of humanity's expansion into space and their encounters with other species. The humans have shown aggressive tendencies in every first contact situation, Zethkai testified. They approach unknown situations with weapons ready and seem to assume that conflict is inevitable. Morrison wanted to object that humanity had tried peaceful contact first in every case, but he knew the council wouldn't care about human intentions. Bennett leaned over and whispered, "Captain, they're not interested in our side of the story. and they've already made up their minds based on what they've observed. The testimony continued with species after species, presenting evidence of humanity's violent history and their concerns about human expansion into the galaxite silicon-based Vorth, showed holographic projections of human wars throughout history and claimed that humanity had been in conflict for most of their recorded civilization. These beings fight constantly. The Vorth representative stated they wage war over resources and territory and ideology, and sometimes for no reason that we can understand. The observers took the stand next, and their testimony was the most damning because they had been secretly watching humanity for 500 years. Observer Prime Yulsith presented detailed records of human behavior and claimed that violence was humanity's first response to any challenge or threat. In all our years of observation, we have never seen a species so quick to resort to warfare, Yulsith said. They are dangerous to themselves and would be even more dangerous to others if allowed to spread throughout the galaxy. Morrison listened to the evidence and realized that much of it was technically accurate because humanity had indeed fought many wars and shown aggressive tendencies, but the Council was only seeing one side of humanity and ignoring everything else about their species, including their capacity for growth and change. Commander Park took notes on everything being said, and Morrison could see her tactical mind working on the problem. But this wasn't a battle that could be won with weapons. The prosecution built their case methodically and presented humanity as a species too dangerous to be allowed freedom in the galaxy. Morrison knew that traditional legal arguments wouldn't work here because the Council had physical evidence of humanity's violent natures. The first day of testimony ended. Morrison realized he would need a completely different approach to save his species from containment or worse. The second day of testimony brought even more devastating evidence against humanity, as the prosecution called witnesses who painted humans as irredeemably violent and dangerous to galactic peace. The Keth Mori Collective presented detailed analysis of Earth's environmental damage and claimed that humanity had nearly destroyed their own planet through warfare and industrial excess. These beings cannot even maintain their own world. The Keth Mori representative declared, how can they be trusted with the responsibility of galactic citizenship when they poison their own air and water? Morrison watched the holographic displays showing polluted rivers and destroyed forests and knew the images were accurate even if they didn't show humanity's recent efforts to repair the damage. The silicon-based Vorth followed with projections showing humanity's likely expansion path through the galaxy and claimed it would threaten 17 peaceful civilizations. Mathematical analysis indicates that human expansion will result in conflict within 50 years. The Vorth calculator stated their territorial instincts and resource requirements make peaceful coexistence impossible. Morrison saw the fear in the alien representatives as they contemplated human expansion and realized they genuinely believed humanity posed an existential threat to their way of life. But the most damaging testimony came from the observers, who had watched humanity longer than any other species and understood human nature better than humans understood themselves. Sarver Prime Yulsith returned to the stand with centuries of data about human behavior and presented it with cold scientific precision. We have monitored the species called humanity for 500 of their years, Yulsith began. During this period they have been engaged in armed conflict. 92% of the time the statistic hung in the air like a physical weight, and Morrison felt the Council's attention focus on this damning evidence. They fight over territory and resources, which is common among primitive species. The observer continued, but they also fight over abstract concepts like ideology and religion and national identity. Morrison knew the testimony was accurate because humanity had indeed spent most of its history at war, but the observer was presenting it without any context. Most disturbing is their tendency to create conflicts where none previously existed. Yulsith stated they will divide themselves into opposing groups based on arbitrary differences and then fight as if their survival depends on it. The observer presented examples of human conflicts that seemed senseless to alien minds, including wars fought over economic systems and religious beliefs. They are the only species we have observed that appears to enjoy conflict, Yulsith concluded. While other species fight for survival or resources, humans often fight simply because Morrison wanted to object that humans didn't enjoy war. But he knew the council would point to human entertainment and sports. That simulated combat prosecution built their case systematically and showed that humanity represented a clear and present danger to the carefully maintained peace of the Galaxy prosecutor. Zendar of the Velter stood to present the final argument. For immediate containment of the human species, the evidence is overwhelming, Zendar declared. Humanity cannot control their violent impulses and will inevitably spread that violence throughout the galaxy if permitted to expand. The prosecutor showed detailed plans for a quantum barrier around the Sol system that would prevent any human ships from leaving their home territory. Containment is the only viable solution, Zendar continued. The alternative is the complete elimination of the human species, which some members of this council have proposed. Morrison felt a chill as he realized that some aliens wanted humanity exterminated rather than simply contained. The prosecutor concluded by stating that humanity had proven through their own actions that they were unfit for galactic citizenship and posed a greater risk to Ignoruan. The prosecution finished their presentation. Morrison was given permission to address the council in humanity's defensia, stood on the small platform at the center of the amphitheater, and looked up at thousands of alien faces watching him with expressions ranging from curiosity to open hostility. Morrison had prepared speeches about humanity's achievements and their potential for growth, but looking at the council he realized that conventional arguments would fail. Aliens had made up their minds based on observable evidence, and no amount of rhetoric would change their opinion about human nature. Bennett had prepared extensive data about human culture and art and scientific achievements, but Morrison knew the council would dismiss it as irrelevant. Commander Park had tactical assessments and defensive strategies, but violence wouldn't solve this problem and might actually prove the aliens were right about humanity. Chief Walsh had sent technical specifications for human technology, hoping to impress the council, but their ships and weapons were primitive compared to alien capabilities. Morrison realized he needed to take a completely different approach, and instead of denying the charges, he decided to embrace them fully. Members of the Galactic Council, Morrison began, I stand before you not to deny the charges against humanity, but to acknowledge that they are completely accurate. The statement caused a ripple of surprise through the chamber, because most species tried to defend themselves rather than admit guilt. Yes, we have been violent throughout our history, Morrison continued. Yes, we have fought countless wars and damaged our own planet and shown aggressive tendencies in our expansion into space. Morrison could see confusion on alien faces because they had expected him to make excuses or claim that humanity had changed, but I stand here to argue that these traits you see as weaknesses are actually humanity's greatest strengths. Morrison said, our capacity for violence has taught us the true value of peace. The council listened with growing interest because no species had ever made this kind of argument before. Morrison explained that human conflicts had driven innovation and social development at a pace unprecedented in galactic history. Every war taught us something about ourselves and every failure made us stronger, Morrison stated. We learned cooperation through competition, and we discovered mercy through experiencing cruelty. He presented examples of human behavior under extreme pressure, including the sacrifices made during natural disasters and the innovations born from desperate necessity. Morrison argued that humanity's willingness to fight had actually saved other species from extinction in recent encounters where humans chose to protect the weak despite no benefit to themselves. The council listened, but remained skeptical, and Morrison could see they weren't convinced by his arguments about the positive aspects of human violence. Morrison continued his defense of humanity by presenting evidence that their capacity for violence was matched by an even greater capacity for heroism and self-sacrifice. You have shown this council recordings of human wars and conflicts, Morrison said, but let me show you what those same humans do when faced with natural disasters and emergencies. Dr. Bennett activated the holographic display and showed footage of humans risking their lives to save strangers during earthquakes and floods, and fires. Images showed people running into burning buildings to rescue others, and volunteers traveling across the world to help disaster victims they had never met. This is the same species you claim is irredeemably violent, Morrison stated. These are the people who will die to save someone they don't even know. The council watched the footage with interest because they rarely saw this side of human nature. In their surveillance data, Morrison presented case studies of human soldiers who had violated direct orders to protect civilian populations, including incidents where humans chose mercy over military advantage. Our capacity for violence exists alongside our capacity for compassion, Morrison explained. We understand the cost of war because we have paid that price. Throughout our history, Dr. Bennett supported Morrison's arguments with psychological data showing how human conflicts had accelerated moral and social development. Every major advance in human rights and ethics has come in response to the horrors of war, Dr. Bennett testified. We learned to value peace because we experienced the alternative. Commander Park presented military case studies where human forces had intervened to protect weaker species from aggressors despite no strategic benefit to Earth. In the Kepler system, humans risked their own ships to evacuate civilians from a planetary bombardment, Park reported. They had no alliance with the local species and no reason to get involved, except that it was the right thing to do. Morrison could see some council members beginning to reconsider their position, but many remained unconvinced about humanity's true nature. High Arbiter Kalthara spoke for the first time during the defense presentation, and her voice carried the weight of millennia. Captain Morrison, you argue that your species' history of violence has made them more peaceful, the Arbiter said. This logic seems contradictory to those of us who have achieved peace through wisdom rather than warfare, Morrison realized. This was the heart of the Council's misunderstanding about humanity, and he needed to address it directly with respect. High Arbiter Morrison replied, I would argue that your species have not achieved peace through wisdom, but through fear and careful balance of power. The statement caused an immediate reaction throughout the chamber as alien representatives began talking among themselves as Morian pressed his advantage and pointed out what he had observed during his time on Nexus Station. The station is heavily armed, despite being built by peaceful species. Morrison noted your council chambers are surrounded by defensive systems and security forces from multiple civilizations. The observation was accurate, but no one had ever mentioned it publicly because it contradicted the narrative of galactic peace. You have not eliminated violence from your societies. Morrison continued, you have simply hidden it behind diplomatic protocols and mutual deterrence. Dr. Bennett presented data they had gathered by observing the council proceedings, including evidence of ongoing tensions between member species. Our scans have detected 14 separate conflicts between council members in the past century, Dr. Bennett reported, all of them suppressed in your official records. The revelation caused a stir in the chamber because the council prided itself on maintaining perfect peace between member species. Morrison could see that his arguments were having an effect, but he knew he needed to make a more direct challenge to the council's assumptions. You fear humanity not because we are uniquely violent, Morrison declared, but because we are honest about our violence while you pretend yours doesn't exist. The accusation hung in the air, and Morrison could feel the tension in the chamber as thousands of aliens considered his words. Prosecutors and Dar stood to object, but Morrison continued before he could be silenced. Every species in this chamber has the capacity for violence, and most of you have used it when necessary. Morrison stated the difference is that humans acknowledge what we are and choose to be better. Morrison presented his final argument about humanity's role in the galaxy, not as reformed warriors, but as honest guardians who understood the true cost of peace. You want to contain us because we remind you of what you really are beneath your civilized facades, Morrison said. We represent the truth. You don't want to face about yourselves. The council fell silent as they considered Morrison's words, and he could see uncertainty in faces that had been confident before. High Arbiter Kalthara called for a recess to allow the council to deliberate, and Morrison was escorted back to his quarters to wait. Captain, do you think they believed us? Dr. Bennett asked as they walked through the corridors of Nexus Station. Morrison looked at the armed guards and defensive systems surrounding them and shook his head. I don't think belief is the issue, Morrison replied. I think the real question is whether they're ready to admit the truth about themselves. Commander Park had been analyzing the council's reaction, and she thought Morrison had planted Seeds of doubt about their moral superiority. They're not as united as they pretend to be. Park observed. Some of those species clearly have ongoing conflicts with each other. Chief Walsh contacted them from the ship to report that he had detected weapons signatures from several Council vessels. Despite their claims of peaceful intentions, Morian realized that the Council's response would depend not on whether they believed humanity deserved freedom, but on whether they could face their own hypocrisies. They waited for the Council to resume. Morrison prepared for what might be his final chance to save humanity from containment or worse. When the Council reconvened, Morrison could see that his arguments had created divisions among the alien representatives, and several species were engaged in heated discussion. Arbiter Kalthara called for order and announced that the prosecution would present their final arguments for humanity's immediate containment. Zendar stood with renewed determination and addressed the Council with passion that hadn't been present in his earlier testimony. Captain Morrison attempts to deflect attention from humanity's crimes by making accusations against this Council, Zendar declared, but his arguments only prove how dangerous humans truly are. The prosecutor argued that Morrison's willingness to attack the Council showed exactly the kind of aggressive behavior that made humanity unsuitable for galactic citizenship. They cannot even defend themselves without turning to accusations and personal attacks. Zendar continued, this proves they will always choose conflict over cooperation. Morrison realized that his strategy had backfired and made the prosecution's case stronger by demonstrating human combativeness. The prosecutor presented a detailed containment plan that would isolate humanity in their home system, using quantum barriers that would prevent any ships from leaving. The evidence is overwhelming that humanity poses a clear and present danger to galactic peace, Zendar stated. Containment is not only justified, but essential for the safety of all civilized species. Several Council members voiced their support for the containment proposal, and some even suggested that elimination might be necessary if containment failed. Morrison felt the weight of his species' fate pressing down on him as the Council moved closer to a decision that would trap humanity forever. The Velter delegation formally proposed immediate implementation of the containment protocol with a secondary authorization for elimination if humans attempted to breach the barriers. We cannot take the risk that these violent primitives will spread their aggression throughout the galaxy, the Velter representative declared. The consequences of inaction are too great. Morrison watched as species after species voiced their support for containment and realized that his defense had failed to change enough minds. Bennett leaned over and whispered urgently about something he had noticed during the proceedings, but Morrison was focused on the growing consensus for containment. Command Park was analyzing the voting patterns and realized that humanity needed to change the fundamental terms of the debate to have any chance of survival. Chief Walsh sent a message from the ship reporting that several alien vessels had moved into positions that would allow them to prevent the human ship from Lavingas. The Council prepared to vote on humanity's fate. Morrison realized he had one final opportunity to address them before the decision became final. High Arbiter Kalthara recognized Morrison for his final statement, and the chamber fell silent. As he stood to speak, Morrison looked around the vast amphitheater and saw thousands of alien faces, watching him with expressions ranging from curiosity to open hostility. Had prepared eloquent speeches about humanity's potential and their contributions to galactic civilization, but looking at the Council, he knew those arguments would fail. Instead, Morrison decided to ask a simple question that had been forming in his mind throughout the proceedings before this Council votes to contain humanity. I have one question for these peaceful species, Morrison said, and his voice carried clearly through the chamber. Aliens leaned forward with interest because they expected him to make a final plea for mercy, or perhaps beg for a reduced sentence. Morrison looked directly at High Arbiter Kalthara and then slowly scanned the entire Council before asking his question. If humanity is contained tomorrow and removed as a threat to galactic peace, which one of you will be the first to attack the other? The question hung in the air, like a physical presence, and for the first time in the entire proceedings, the Council chamber fell completely silent. Morrison could see shock and surprise on alien faces as they processed what he had asked and realized the implications. You have built your entire case on the premise That humanity is uniquely dangerous, Morrison continued, but I have observed this council for days and seen the truth you don't want to acknowledge. He pointed to specific examples he had noticed, including the seating arrangements that reflected military alliances. Rather than unity, the Velter and Kethmori delegates refused to sit near each other despite being on the same side of this issue. Morrison observed the Silicon Vorth have positioned themselves with clear escape routes and defensive advantage. Morrison continued, identifying the subtle signs of tension and mistrust that permeated the supposedly peaceful council. The Zephyrians sit elevated above everyone else, in a position of superiority, while the younger species cluster together for mutual protection. Morrison noted the accuracy of his observations was undeniable, and the council members shifted uncomfortably as their hidden dynamics were exposed. You have created a stable peace not through evolution beyond violence, but through mutual deterrence and fear, Morrison declared. Every species here is capable of violence, and that capability is what maintains your peace. Morrison could see understanding dawning on alien faces as they realized he was describing the true nature of their galactic civilization. Without humanity as a common threat, how long before old rivalries resurface? Morrison asked. How long before resource disputes become armed conflicts? The question struck at the heart of the council's fears, because they knew their peace was more fragile than they admitted. You want to eliminate us because we represent the honesty you lack about your own violent nature, Morrison concluded. We are what you could become if you stopped lying to yourselves. The chamber remained silent as thousands of aliens contemplated the uncomfortable truth Morrison had forced them to confront. The Arbiter Kelthar finally broke the silence with a voice that seemed less certain than before. High Arbiter Kelthar looked around the silent chamber, and Morrison could see uncertainty in her ancient eyes for the first time since the trial began. What exactly are you proposing, Captain Morrison? The Arbiter asked, and her voice lacked the absolute authority it had carried before. Morrison realized this was the moment that would determine humanity's fate, and he needed to offer something the Council could accept. Without losing face, partnership, Morrison replied simply, not as your subjects seeking approval, but as equals who understand that peace requires the capacity for war. The proposal caused immediate discussion throughout the chamber, as alien representatives considered this unexpected alternative to containment. Maurice continued before the Council could reject his offer outright. Humanity offers to serve as honest guardians of galactic peace, Morrison explained. We will acknowledge what we are and use that knowledge to protect what you have built. Dr. Bennett stood and presented data showing how human military forces had already intervened to protect weaker species in recent conflicts. Humans have demonstrated that they will fight to defend others even when there is no benefit to themselves. Dr. Bennett testified this makes them ideal peacekeepers for situations too dangerous for other species. Commander Park added tactical analysis showing how human combat experience could strengthen the Council's defensive capabilities. Human forces have developed strategies and techniques that could prevent conflicts rather than simply respond to them. Park reported, our understanding of violence makes us better at stopping it. Morrison could see some Council members considering the proposal, but others remained skeptical about trusting humanity with any responsibility. The Velter delegation immediately objected to the idea of giving humans any role in galactic security. These violent primitives cannot be trusted with the responsibility of maintaining peace. The Velter representative declared they would use any authority granted to them to spread their aggressive nature, but other species began to see the logic in Morrison's proposal, and several delegates spoke in favor of at least considering. If silicon-based Vorth performed rapid calculations and announced that human intervention could actually reduce the probability of major conflicts. Mathematical analysis indicates that honest acknowledgement of violent capacity creates more stable deterrence than pretending such capacity does not exist. The Vorth calculator reported. Morrison realized that his question about which species would attack first had forced the Council to confront the fragility of their peace. The observers, who had testified against humanity earlier, now seemed thoughtful about the proposal. Observe Prime Yilsith stood and addressed the Council. With obvious reluctance, our long study of humanity reveals that they are indeed violent and dangerous. Yulsith began, but we have also observed that they are capable of extraordinary self-control when they choose to exercise it. The observer presented examples of human behavior that contradicted their earlier testimony, including incidents where humans had shown remarkable restraint under extreme provocation. Perhaps the question is not whether humans are violent, but whether they can channel that violence toward constructive purposes. Yulsith concluded. High Arbiter Kalthara called for formal debate on Morrison's proposal, and the chamber erupted with discussion. As species argued about the wisdom of trusting humanity, Morrison watched the debate and realized that his simple question had fundamentally changed the nature of the conversation. Instead of discussing whether to contain humanity, the council was now debating whether to give them a role in maintaining galactic security. Bennett pointed out that the council's reaction proved Morrison's point about their hidden violent nature. Look how quickly they turned to arguing when faced with an uncomfortable truth. Dr. Bennett observed, they're no more peaceful than we are. Commander Park noted the military positioning of various species and how quickly they had moved to defensive stances when their peace was questioned. Edgeoff Walsh reported from the ship that the alien vessels had begun backing away from attack positions. As the council's focus shifted to the new proposal after hours of debate, High Arbiter Kalthara called for order and announced that the council would vote on Morrison's alternative proposal. Humanity requests partnership rather than containment, the Arbiter stated. They offer to serve as guardians who acknowledge the violent nature that others prefer to hide. Morrison held his breath as the voting began, and species after species cast their decisions on humanity's fatigue. Vote was closer than anyone had expected, with many species abstaining rather than choosing sides. When the final tally was announced, Morrison felt relief wash over him as the partnership proposal passed. By a narrow margin, the council grants humanity conditional membership with a probationary period, during which they will prove their worth as guardians of peace. Kalthara announced its decision came with strict conditions, including oversight by council forces and regular reviews of human behavior. But Morrison knew they had won something unprecedented in galactic history as the first species to gain membership by embracing rather than denying their violent natures. They used defiance. Departed Nexus Station Chief Walsh asked Morrison about their victory. Captain, did we really just convince them by calling them hypocrites? Walsh wondered. Morrison smiled as he looked back at the massive station and the civilization it represented. No, Danny, we convinced them by being the only ones willing to tell the truth about what peace really costs. Morrison replied. The journey home gave Morrison time to reflect on what they had achieved and what it meant for humanity's future in the galaxy. They had gained membership in the Galactic Council not as reformed warriors but as honest guardians who understood that the price of peace was the willingness to fight for it. Morrison knew the probationary period would be difficult and that many species still doubted humanity's fitness for galactic citizenship. They had established a new precedent that honesty about violent capacity could be a strength rather than a weakness. As Earth came into view, Morrison felt pride in what his species had accomplished and hope for what they might become. A humanity would take their place among the stars, not as the most peaceful species, but as the most honest about the costs of maintaining peace.